Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Wedlock-Kilpatrick, and I serve as Program Director for the Prison and Jail Ministries for NBA. And as we get started, I want to inform you all that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing to each of our participants, as well as on the NBA website at nbacares.org. As you know, this webinar is designed to assist our group in its preparation for our November immigration detention immersion trip in San Diego, California, and Tijuana, Mexico. And so today we will be discussing immigration detention in the United States, what has changed, and why are children and families being incarcerated. You see, we've seen the various accounts of refugees and immigrants being imprisoned inhumanely, and we're wondering, what is the current legal situation that permits this, and what has changed? We also know that there are people now huddled on our borders and treated as the enemy. So what's the difference today that has created this crisis? This webinar will explore the current legal status of our immigration laws and offer a glimpse into the challenges faced by so many at our borders. As followers of Jesus and the God of justice and mercy, you will learn ways to respond to this crisis by putting love into action. This webinar will serve as a resource for how we can begin to respond to the crisis collectively and in our local communities. May it also be a tool that we can use for discussion and a call to action in our congregations, in our regions, and in our general church ministries. Today's webinar will start with a presentation, and after the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. And so we invite you that throughout the webinar, if you have a question that emerges, to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can click that feature, submit your question. I will gather those questions, and when it's Q&A time, I will share those with our presenters. If we're unable to get to your question, we will certainly capture that and share out with our presenters later and have them respond to you, and also share that with the group. Also, if you need technical assistance, you may use the Q&A feature, and again, I'll respond to you appropriately. If there's anyone participating by phone, feel free to email me at mkilpatrick@nbacares.org with your questions or needs for assistance. So let me introduce or present our guest for the day. Tana Lubiers joined Disciples Home Missions as the Immigration Legal Counsel in July 2011. Prior to joining DHM, Tana was an immigration attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at the North Carolina Justice Center's Immigrants Legal Assistance Project, where she represented clients in immigration court and worked to combat the negative effects of increasing immigrant detentions. Tana also represented migrant workers and trafficking victims at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Atlanta, El Centro de los Derechos de Migrante in Zacatecas, Mexico, and the Farm Worker Union of Legal Aid of North Carolina in Raleigh, North Carolina. Tana resides in Durham, North Carolina with her husband and her daughter. And the Reverend Dr. Sharon Stanley Ray is the Director of Refugee and Immigration Ministries, a ministry also of Disciples Home Mission. RIM works to mobilize Disciples congregations around the country to offer hospitality to immigrants, provide refugee resettlement assistance to refugees, strengthen relationships of solidarity and advocacy with refugees and immigrants, and seek justice for farm workers. RIM's office is located in National City Christian Church in DC. Sharon is a nationally trained faith-based community organizer through PICO, or now Faith in Action, and serves as the chair of the DC cluster of congregations for the DC, Virginia, Maryland Sanctuary Congregations Network. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church and holds clergy standing as well with us disciples. So welcome, Sharon. And Dean Bucalis, the Reverend Dean Bucalis, serves as Executive Director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond in Louisville, Kentucky, which is an ecumenical re-entry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon their release from prison. MBA 3 is also an MBA Incubate and Connect partner. Dean serves as the mission specialist with MBA Prison and Jail Ministries. And as a retired attorney, Dean has a background in immigration law. So I thank you each for being with us, and I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dean and then Tana and Sharon.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure to be able to present this important webinar, and we are so pleased to have Tana and Sharon here to help us navigate these very important and tricky waters that have become immigration and refugee issues in our country. When the National Benevolent Association started the Prison and Jail Ministries, it became apparent that shortly thereafter we needed to expand the scope of that to include immigration detention, because so much of the work that was going on throughout the country was also transcending the issues that involve those who are coming into our country and those who are being detained. So we're delighted to have Tana and Sharon help us understand better some of the issues that are before us. Tana's going to begin by giving us an overview of the immigration landscape as it relates to many of the legal issues that are involved. And as part of that, she's going to also give us a little bit of history and explain how we got into this particular situation. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we weren't talking about these issues much, although they still existed. But it seems that every day there's more and more in the news that relates to immigration and refugee issues that now confront our country. And then when Tana is completed her presentation, we'll turn it over to Sharon, who will also share her experiences in this area, many of which are on the ground, and she will be able to share some of her personal experiences, but also to enlighten us in ways that the faith community and faith members can become involved on a local level, on a national level, and even on a global level. People ask, well, what can I do? There's a lot that can be done. And Sharon's going to share with us some of the ways in which we all can get involved. The hope is that those of you who will be going on the immersion trip will take this information, find it helpful as a context for that trip, and be able to begin processing this information, ask more questions, and bring these back to your respective regions and to the work that you're doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Tana now, and she's going to give us a little background in the legal issues.
Okay. I just share my screen with you all here. All right. Is that working, Dean? Okay. Good to be with you all today. As Dean said, I'm Tana Lubiers. I know many of you. I'm your Disciples Immigration and Legal Counsel, and I know many of you are already deeply involved with these issues. My hope is that in this short time we have together, I can give you a deeper understanding of the systems that are creating some of the reality that you'll be seeing firsthand on the border. Because immigration detention and family detention exist in the context of the larger deportation system and the larger asylum system and the ability of people seeking protection in the United States. So I'm not going to get too granular in the history of family detention, but I did want to point out just a little bit here. We opened our first family detention center specifically geared to holding exclusively families in 2001. And then we ramped that up in 2006 with the opening of T-Don Hutto, which was a first large-scale family detention facility. And I bring this up because the beginning of family detention it is enlightening to what we're dealing with now. Why were these detention facilities opened in the first place? It was presented at the time as a solution to separating families. And we've seen that over history, this swing between separating families and family detention. Like last summer with the much needed outcry about separating families, then we started to hear, well, at least they're detained together. The problem, of course, is that many of these people are fleeing for their lives, are facing untold persecution and torture, and we have an administration that is wholly unprepared to deal with the women and children, especially, who are coming here, and that is what is creating this humanitarian crisis. Instead, we're getting false solutions like separating families, family detention, things like let's just deport them faster, or don't let them in at all. And it doesn't recognize the reality of what they're fleeing from. So what we're seeing now is not so much new as a new manifestation of an old problem. The theme of pretty much every presentation I've given since 2016 is this. Immigration has always been hard, especially in the past few decades. It is worse now. It's always been hard. It is worse now. You all are very familiar with the racist and nativist rhetoric coming out of the highest levels of our government. But I encourage us to pay attention to the policy and the regulations that are actually implementing that rhetoric, that these are arcane things that are actually causing the trauma and misery on the ground. In my opinion, the systems are largely the same. The first time I walked into an immigration detention center was in 2001, and I counted 14 airlock doors between where I was meeting with my client and the outside world, and a whole lot of barbed wire. And even at that time, this was considered non-punitive civil detention, and that's how we justify it. So that system has not changed all that much, but there are policy details that have changed, and we'll cover that as we go along. All right, so when I want to talk about how people get into detention. Let's start at the beginning here. And I'm going to divide this up into two systems that are somewhat separate. One is interior enforcement. That's people who are here and we want to get rid of. And then border enforcement, people who are trying to come here and we're trying to keep out. We'll emphasize the border enforcement because that's where you all are headed. But I did want to bring up interior enforcement because it's completely relevant to all of us, no matter where we live. We saw the raids in Mississippi just last week, and these are happening everywhere across the US in various forms. So we're talking about interior enforcement as a route to immigration detention, and who's subject to this? Who's at risk for this kind of interior enforcement? I just wanted to point out undocumented people, any undocumented person can be deported, and that includes family members of US citizens who are waiting in line. It includes people with no criminal record whatsoever. It includes people who are waiting for an employment visa. They have a job offer, but they are still waiting in that backlog. It includes dreamers who came to the US as children. It includes people who had visas but then overstayed or violated the terms in some way, people who fled war or disaster in their home countries but for any number of reasons are not eligible for asylum. It of course includes people who entered the US without documentation, and it of course includes children as well. So here's how it works. I drew you a picture of just kind of how this process works, getting into immigration detention. You can be arrested directly by ICE. These are those raids, worksite raids, large-scale raids, small-scale raids that we're seeing. And then you can also be arrested directly by local law enforcement. And that looks like a lot of different things. It could be someone is arrested for driving without a license, or someone is arrested for driving while brown. And then they are taken into local custody where their fingerprints are run through national databases, and then they end up in ICE detention. Once they're in ICE detention, ICE officers have the discretion to release many people. Some people are subject to mandatory detention, meaning they can't get out, but some people are. One change we're seeing now is that where there used to be some ICE officers who would release people, now they're disinclined and have no motivation from above to use their discretion to set bond for people or release them. So more people are being held in detention through that process. Again, this is not that part about not using the discretion is new, but the rest of the system is not new. I spent the early years in the Obama administration defending domestic violence victims who had been picked up through this system. Victims, they had called the police to get help, but then they themselves had been arrested and then funneled into ICE detention. So the system can work that way too. All right, detention centers. I like this particular map of detention centers because it includes not just the ICE-run detention centers, but all the contract facilities, including local jurisdictions that just have even short-term, like 72-hour contracts with some of the, so it would be like a county jail has a contract with ICE to hold ICE detainees. And you'll see it's pretty much every state. Here's it broken down into numbers. And you can also, if you're so inclined, look on the ICE website and see where where near you there are ICE detention centers. Again, this one doesn't include the contract facilities, like the short-term contracts, but it will give you an idea. There are ones close to you. All right. So how long people are detained completely depends on how long their case takes. So I wanted to show you just a couple numbers of, we've got record level of pending cases right now, upwards almost towards 1 million of pending cases currently in the backlog, waiting in immigration court. So that of course translates into longer waits per case. The average amount of time it takes from beginning to getting a decision from the immigration judge is headed towards 2 years. I will say that detained cases do move a little faster. The detained docket, they move it along a little faster because the government is paying to house people, and so they want to deport people faster. But just to give you an idea, when we're talking about immigration detention, this is the kind of time periods we're looking at. So someone gets into ICE detention, they may be released, they may not. Then where their fate is decided is in immigration court. And people who are in detention are much less likely to have access to legal counsel and are much less likely to win their case. Detention is designed to make people give up. And so it has a very direct impact on the outcomes of people's deportation cases. Removal proceedings are, immigration court has never been a bastion of due process. Immigration judges actually work for the executive branch. They're not part of the judiciary. And under the current administration, we've seen that immigration judges are having even less independence. They are being forced to deport people faster. They are being forced to refuse continuances so that people can find counsel and get evidence for their cases. We were even seeing the Attorney General certifying cases to himself and single-handedly remaking law not in the favor of immigrants. So immigration court that has never been very much in favor of immigrants it's harder to win these days.
Can I ask a question about the procedure? So when somebody is picked up on the street for driving without a license or a minor type of crime, and they go into the state court system, is there a requirement now that that person be referred to ICE, or is that in the discretion of the state judge?
That's a good question. It varies by jurisdiction. So some localities have agreements with ICE where actually some of their local police are delegated, are acting as officers of ICE. Some just do the database check and send their info off to the national databases. And then, of course, there are some who are refusing to share that info and refusing to put detainers on people. And those are what we call sanctuary jurisdictions. So it varies based on where you are in the country. Yeah. I want to point out that this is the basic system, but there's other ways that people go straight from ICE detention to deportation. And those are increasingly used today. One is reinstatement, which is just if someone has been deported before and then they re-entered, they can be deported without ever having a chance to plead their case before an immigration judge. Same with if they have a removal order for another reason. And then there's a lot of pressure, especially in detention, for people to sign, they're called stipulated orders, or there's also called voluntary removal. None of it is voluntary, but that's what it's called. There's pressure when you're in detention to give up. Detention is designed to make people give up. A number of years ago, I had a client who I called to check on him. He was in detention, didn't have anyone to pay his bonds, so wasn't able to get out. And I called and he was on the plane that morning, and I made them take him off the plane, of course. But when I was finally able to talk to him, I said, "What happened? You know, why?" And he said, "Well, they put me in a room and they had guns and they told me that my case had been lost and there was no chance of me ever getting out of detention unless I signed this paper." And so those kind of intimidation tactics are not unusual, nor have they been. All right.
Another question. I'm sorry, but it's intriguing to me, the posting of bond. Is that something that is applicable to everyone who's in detention, or is that just discretionary as well? And then how are those bond amounts set? Is there some schedule that they use?
Okay, we're getting a little bit detailed here, but happy to. So there are bonds for whatever if someone was picked up by local enforcement, there are bonds for whatever they were picked up on the state level. And then immigration bonds are not set automatically. So an ICE officer can say, "I'm going to set a $2,000 bond or a $2,500 bond for you." But they rarely do anymore. And so most people, if they want even a bond amount set for them, have to have an attorney go before the immigration judge and request a bond amount. The judge doesn't have to even set bond for people. Some people won't get an amount set for them. And then people who do, it depends on, they look at what their criminal record is or even what pending charges are. They don't have to be convicted. And then flight risk is what they're supposed to consider. And they're usually several $1,000s. Yeah, so it's a hard thing for many people to even if they do have a bond set to get out. Back to that kind of light blue arrow about how people go straight from detention to deportation. One thing that we're seeing right now, especially, is expedited removal. This has existed since the Clinton administration, but it allows ICE officers to make the decision to deport someone without giving them a chance to go before a judge. And so previously it was used only for people who had been in the United States for less than 14 days and were caught within 100 miles of the border. One of the first things that President Trump did in office was issue an executive order to expand expedited removal such that it would apply to anyone who was found anywhere in the United States and could not prove that they had been here for over 2 years. Just last month, they have begun implementing this policy. We've already seen through the past 2 administrations, about a third of deportations are done with expedited removal when someone has no chance to go before a judge. And we can expect that to increase. All right, so that's that light blue arrow about just straight shot to deportation. All right. Let's switch over to the other side, to border enforcement. That was interior enforcement. We're going to look at border enforcement, and specifically we're going to talk about asylum in that context, because that's what you all have been hearing about on the news, and that's what you'll see when you're down at the border. So who is coming? Who is coming seeking asylum? I haven't been down to the border since this spring, but I will tell you, I expected to meet with a lot of Central American asylum seekers and Mexican, but I did not expect to meet quite so many people from Cameroon, from Yemen, from Russia, from Myanmar, from Haiti. And I was part of a legal team, and we were assessing our language capacity, and you know, everyone spoke Spanish and English, of course, but then other people said, well, you know, I speak Russian, or I speak Arabic, or I speak French, and just no one thought they would use those languages, but we used all of them. We used every single language we could, including indigenous languages, Mam, Quiche, Mixteco. So it's really people from all over the world coming to our southern border, seeking protection. It's legal to seek asylum. It's legal to walk up to the border and request asylum. That's under international law, that's under US law. This is the US law that defines asylum seekers, refugees. Both. We use it in the asylum context, and it's just someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. What does that mean? Basically, it's not just people fleeing for their life. It's not just people coming from a country that is descending into violence and chaos or civil war. It is people who are able to prove that they were targeted for a specific characteristic of themselves. And I thought what I would do to kind of give you a better idea of how asylum actually works is to just give you a couple examples. Specifically in the gang and domestic violence-based asylum context, because that's a lot of what we're seeing. These are cases that have always been difficult, and several years ago were just denied outright. There have been some creative arguments made in the meantime, but those, of course, right now under the current administration are getting harder. So, for example, a woman from Honduras was threatened by a gang. They threatened that they would kill her if her son didn't join the gang. And so her case was granted because they found that her family relationship was her particular social group, and that was the reason that she was persecuted. But the son was denied. Another example, from El Salvador, a gang kidnapped a son because the father refused to sell drugs in his grocery store, and he was denied because the court found that the reason he was targeted was because he owned a grocery store. A Guatemalan woman was beaten and raped by her husband for years, and she fled with her children. She was denied asylum. Another woman in a domestic violence relationship was targeted, they found, because she had children from a previous relationship, and that qualified her for asylum. So it looks a little crazy in terms of who wins and who loses, and that's really the state of the law right now. It's particularly hard when you're down at the border and you're talking to people who are desperate to get in, and it's hard to tell people that they may or may not even have a shot at winning asylum, of being able to stay in the United States. So let me explain a little bit just how this process works from the border. This is how it's supposed to work, and then we'll go back and talk about how there are changes to this now. You're supposed to be able to walk up to this port of entry and request asylum. This is Chaparral. I don't know if you'll go across this Head West entry. Probably. This is one of the main walking. ports of entry. And you're supposed to be able to walk up to that gate and say, I want asylum in the United States. We'll talk about why that's not happening. From there, you're supposed to be able to then go into a holding cell held by Customs and Border Protection. These are the hileras, the ice boxes that you see on the news, people being held in these extremely cold conditions, and the perreras, which are literally translated dog kennels. I feel like the Spanish words for these places are descriptive. And you've seen these, of course, on the news. A lot of these are holding cells for Customs and Border Protection where people are placed temporarily, although not temporarily enough. So from there, they should either be released, it's called parole, or they should be granted a bond, or they should be put on an ankle monitor and sent to be with family waiting to receive them in the United States. Or they could continue to be held in ICE detention. And again, we're talking about for the length of people's immigration cases. And so that's ICE detention for however long it takes them to get through that court process. Let's see, kids. The process is similar, except that they're not supposed to be held in ICE detention. They're supposed to be transferred. If they can't be released to family members, they're supposed to be held in shelters that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And those are supposed to be less punitive, less prison-like. We're seeing now that more children are being held because for many reasons, but one reason being that ICE is targeting the families who are coming forward to claim their children. And so if people don't have immigration status, then they're at risk when they come to claim their children out of detention. All right, so here's kind of how the whole system is supposed to work. This is not a new system. Whether they're released or whether they remain in detention, they're supposed to get a credible fear interview, which is just that, a preliminary interview that is the first time to tell their story. It's the first time to explain why they walked thousands of miles, in some cases flew across the world to Ecuador and then hiked on foot up through jungles and incredible violence and danger and hunger all the way to the United States to seek asylum. It's supposed to be a threshold interview. It's supposed to just determine whether someone might have a claim at all. It is no longer that. People in general have to very much prove their claims at that stage of the process these days. And if not, they get deported immediately. If they somehow pass that, then they're allowed to go on and apply for asylum. Again, whether they're still detained or whether they are released. Then they're allowed to go on and apply for asylum in immigration court. Again, removal proceedings is where the judge decides your fate, and the deck is stacked against you at that point, especially if you're in detention and can't get counsel.
Tana, let me ask a question real quickly about this process now that's being utilized. So if somebody only has it can only show a credible fear, they're subject to being deported, even if they have claimed to have a well-founded fear. And so how can people who come into the country who have no supporting evidence, how can they prove their cases at that stage without the benefit of an attorney or documentation? Has that dramatically reduced the number of asylum claims that have been granted?
I don't know the numbers, but your point is well taken, and that's exactly the problem. The legal teams I was working with in Tijuana, that's what we were preparing people for, was to be able to represent themselves in their credible fear interviews to get through that first hurdle, because, you know, the 1 hour that they had with me or another volunteer was all they would get before they were, you know, held in an ice box and then pushed over to ICE detention and forced to tell the most horrific things that had ever happened to them to a government official. Yeah. Okay. All right, that's how it's supposed to work, believe it or not. Let's talk about some of the newer roadblocks to even getting into that process. One thing that we're seeing now on the ground in Tijuana and all along the other the ports of entry on the border cities, we're seeing it's changing quickly. So so my information is just a couple months old here, but even then it might be different by the time you all get down there. But for the last while here, we've been seeing, we're calling it metering. And basically what that is every morning, this is the plaza right by the port of entry in Tijuana. And people, a woman who's actually an asylum seeker herself, sets up one of those like beach canopies and a folding table. And she writes a list, here's the list of people who are seeking asylum, and gives them a number. And then they have to wait until their number is called to be able to walk up to that gate to request asylum. This is completely illegal, but it is being done in collusion with the Customs and Border Protection of the United States and Mexican authorities, particularly Grupos Beta. And so this is a system that is keeping people from even getting to the gate to ask for asylum, to even start that asylum process. The other thing that is derailing this system is the Remain in Mexico program. It's officially called the Migrant Protection Protocols. You won't catch me calling it that. It has nothing to do with protecting migrants. But basically what happens is people, after they wait in that long line, which is sometimes weeks, sometimes months, while they're homeless or in a shelter in Tijuana, after having trekked miles to even get there, they or finally get their number called. They're taken to the port of entry, they request asylum, they're put in the ice box, the hilera, and then they're held for hours or days, and then they're dumped back on the Mexican side of the border with a sheaf of paperwork. The people I met who had been subject to this new program were a different level of distraught. I have to say they thought they had arrived and then they found themselves back in Mexico. They are supposed to then get a chance to go to an immigration court hearing in San Diego. But their chances of surviving for many of them who are still fleeing their persecutors in Mexico, much less being able to care for themselves, much less being able to get legal counsel to fight their case from Mexico, is greatly reduced. Another new thing that we're seeing, a roadblock to even getting with it to the system, you've heard probably on the news about safe third countries. We have a safe third country agreement with Canada, which makes a certain amount of sense. If someone arrives in Canada and they're seeking asylum, we say, you have to apply in Canada. You can't go through Canada and then come to the United States, and vice versa. If you arrive in the United States first, you have to apply here. You can't then apply in Canada. It does not make sense for a place like Guatemala, where many people are fleeing themselves, and they're the same gangs that they're fleeing from, even if they're not from Guatemala, from their home countries, infiltrated there. Yeah, there are court challenges that, and so it's an ongoing question. What you'll probably hear from a lot of the advocates on the ground is that in many ways, on the border right now, it's a lawless zone. Some of the things that are happening are not legal in any way, particularly regarding kids, unaccompanied minors who are just young people traveling on their own, are just blatantly being turned away. They're not able to get on that list at all. And there's no way for them to even approach the border and request asylum. There's stories of young people being chased by Mexican authorities, and then even young people who do get in, some of them have just been dumped back on the Mexican side of the border for no legal justification. I can't even understand what their status is at that point. So of course, this is the legal system. This is doing it the right way. And so of course, this is pushing people into the desert out of desperation, if they feel like that's a better option for them. If they're fleeing for their lives, risking death in the desert and criminal prosecution might be something to consider. So I'll wrap up. This is not about the rule of law when we're talking about U.S. detention. It's about keeping people out. It's about making people give up. Our U.S. immigration system is designed purposely to deter people. That's the stated purpose of it. And so what does that mean when you're trying to deter people who are fleeing death, who are fleeing dismemberment, rape, or worse? At best, we're talking about prison conditions, and at worst, we're talking about state-sponsored torture. It has always been hard. It is worse now. I hope that kind of gives you some sense of how the detention plays into the asylum system and the deportation system. You can see some of those connections. And particularly, I hope you can kind of be aware of the false solutions that are being presented to us now, that family detention was a solution to separating families, or that deporting people faster is a solution for people who are fleeing those same places where they'll be deported to. At this point, I will turn it over to Sharon. Sharon and I make a good team because I depress and appall you with all of this reality. And she is going to come in and she's going to pick you up off the floor and tell you what you can do about it.
Hi, can you hear me? Are you able to hear me, Dean, and others?
Yeah.
Good. Well, Tana, thank you so much for telling us the realities. They are not at all realities that any of us want to hear. They are terrifying, they are frightening, and they are ones that impact the bodies and the souls of all of us, but most particularly, of course, impact those who have been suffering. And I want to really start and move in a transition from Tana's reports of realities to scripture, because I think it takes absolutely that much of a turn in order for us to have a chance of maintaining faith and hope in this context. And I think as we begin to move into some things we can potentially do ourselves in ways that we can support immigrants who are beloved neighbors among us and those who are trying to seek safety and protection in our country, that it may be helpful as we move into this part for you to consider if you know an individual, a family, or others who have literally felt the consequences of the violence, both the violence in their home countries and the violence, I would say, of the types of poverty, of the types of policies that we have on the border and the interior now affecting immigrants. And I would encourage you, if you do know that person or that family, or perhaps many of them, to hold them nearly to you now, because we are needing to claim, as we think of those neighbors that we love so deeply, the inspiration of our Christ, who above all was an embodied Christ, was one who came as Jesus in the body to the world with specific intent to engage right here and to have his life impacted physically on this earth. And I lift up again the words that Jesus proclaimed at the very start of his ministry in Luke 4:18 and 19, which themselves were quoting from the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, when he reminded us of his mission as being one to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to those who were captivated, and to set at liberty those who were oppressed. And so let us move forward to the next slide. We are inspired by that Jesus because we know that as he became the Christ, he gave his body and his blood that had suffered, his body that had hurt and endured pain, even as is the case for migrants when they are arriving on our border, who most often by the point of arriving have spent many months and sometimes years, first in tragedies and pain in their homelands, and then throughout many months of the journey itself. And we remember here the words of Luke 22 of Jesus's commitment to offer his body, to offer his blood, and that through that we would find strength for each day of our journeys. We'll go to the next slide. So we claim that power, the power of Jesus's own ministry, which was a ministry actively of his body. His death was a commitment fully of his body and blood. And so we can know for sure that our call to justice is a call that is seeking to engage us in using our whole bodies as well, to seek improvements and conditions for the lives of those who are suffering the most. And I also want to lift up here one of my mentors as well, having ministered for many years in the Central Valley of California, Dolores Huerta, who, when asked by those who felt that it was impossible for her to organize individuals who were migrants in the Central Valley, when she was told they can't possibly have power, her response was, "Don't tell me that, because what we know for sure is that the power is in your body. The power is in everybody." And so our question then becomes, how might we use our bodies to follow God's mission in this day and to continue to act? We'll move ahead. I want to invite us, and those of you who know me know that also I have a beagle, and so I lift up the kind of image that is in the top on the left, because I think even as I see our own beagle constantly driven by her nose to follow faithfully and to search out realities that might be missing to the eyesight, I think in many ways that's also a kind of metaphor for what is needed in this time of changing immigration policies that are increasingly restrictive. So we can be encouraged to follow good faith practices, certainly to follow our practice as communities of faith, to study scripture, to engage in prayer, to hold vigils. And so I refer you to some of the resources that are on our website now, one that is an 8-part Bible study related to how to turn walls into welcome. Also, resources that are offered for every different holiday and holy day as we move through the liturgical calendar, each of them produced by both our office and also other interfaith partners with whom we work. You'll see the picture at the right across the top of the screen represents an image related to a vigil that we just sent out resources for at the beginning of this week in the context and at this time of grief since the time of the shootings in El Paso. And I would encourage you also to look for those, to offer them to your communities as ways of healing, as ways of teaching and of solidarity with immigrants who are suffering in this time. We'll move forward. As we follow faith practices, we want to continue to follow shared faith values. And I wanted to include these because some of these represent many of the key values that we as disciples, who are one of the faith partners that together serves with 52 other national faith organizations, many of them Protestant, a number of Catholic groups, other organizations such as Church World Service and Sojourners, as well as multiple Jewish and Muslim partners, work collectively in the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. And we meet constantly in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And many of our key values are related to the kind of issues that we're talking about today, in particular the one of how do we protect human rights in our enforcement practices and in what our policies are in the border. How can we protect vulnerable communities who are seeking asylum and who are, through both U.S. and international humanitarian law, supposed to be able to access it in our country. We'll move to the next slide. I also invite you to keep following realities of immigrant challenges over time. And it's wonderful that we're having an opportunity to go together soon to the border. But what we can know for sure is that our work and our commitment is needed upon return as well, because of the length of time, as Tana has referred to, that many cases may take, and also because of the depth of the challenges and the realities now. And so one of the new ways that you can, as a disciple and as a leader among disciples congregations, how you can help your local communities engage more is by encouraging congregations to become immigrant welcoming congregations. And so we want to refer you to the interest sign-up form that you see listed and urge you to contact our colleague Valeria Bahar, who is our new Disciples Immigration Response Specialist. Many of you met Valeria at General Assembly as she was just beginning work the week before that, and Valeria can help you can begin that process that gives you one way with ongoing support that you can continue to unfold your faith community's partnerships with immigrants. We'll go to the next slide. We ask you to always follow the leadership of immigrant partners. As United We Dream, Dreamers are constantly educating all of us. Nothing about us without us, nothing about us without us. Make sure that you are following the lead of immigrant rights partners. And you see on this slide, certainly not all of them, but many of the key partners with which disciples are working, a number of disciples congregations particularly in California, are working with the Matthew 25 movement. The LORED network is our partnership of faith communities around the country who are linked together with what used to be called PICO, now called Faith in Action Network, the National TPS Alliance, etc. So many great organizations. We'll go to the next. Tana referred a bit to this already in talking about who she saw at the border, and I am sure as well, having been just in recent months together with Terry Hord Owens and also with Global Ministries at the border, specifically in Tijuana, that we are very likely to see multiple populations when you are there. In particular, Haitian populations are very strongly represented in the Tijuana area and also strongly represented in our congregations as disciples. We are likewise seeing detentions in the interior of the U.S. of a number of Southeast Asians. Southeast Asians have about 14,000 community members, have active orders of deportation, and we have tragically begun to see, especially over the last year and a half, multiple groups of, in particular, Cambodians, some Vietnamese deported, but especially Cambodians, along with pressure by the administration to try to encourage Vietnam and Laos to receive back more and more individuals who had come to the U.S. originally with the legal status as refugees years ago. They came as war refugees. But now, because of brushes with the law, many of them from decades ago, due to changes in immigration laws, their offenses that were misdemeanors in that time have become felonies. And so now they are being pushed by the administration in increasing numbers towards deportation. We also want to remember individuals in our disciples congregations, such as our Liberian congregation in Beltsville, Maryland. And you see in the bottom picture on the left side of the right picture, our pastor in that church, Reverend Lloyd, who spoke at General Assembly about the ways that Liberians are at risk now of losing deferred and forced departure, and that then puts them at risk of deportation. We'll continue. We really want to invite you. Part of what we can do, and one of the things I think that is particularly important in this time, is to follow the conditions that exist in detention centers. And you no doubt hear from a number of immigrant advocacy groups speaking against those conditions, but I want to really call out that it's Homeland Security and the Office of Inspector General internal reports that quite often are the ones who first are documenting some of the horrific conditions that exist. And so we've heard an incredible surge just throughout this summer in these reports from June and from July, and actions that have happened even since the time of General Assembly in especially strong ways over the last couple of weeks. For example, you see in the upper right picture a number of Jewish communities who used the religious holiday of Tisha B'Av, the day of greatest mourning in the Jewish heritage, as a time when just over this past weekend, they lifted up in multiple locations their refusal to accept the kind of horrific conditions that exist. And these are important ways that we as faith communities, through our public actions, can demand that ICE really does, will be held accountable, and we can communicate our faith values, that it is never okay to us that these kind of abhorrent conditions exist. Let's go forward. Also, thank you to the many of you who at General Assembly participated as well in another kind of call for accountability to the kind of conditions that we know that children have been subjected to in many detention centers, and that led even to the deaths of the children that we lifted up in our evening vigil on Sunday night. And I want to make sure that everyone remembers how important it is to sign if you have not yet, and to consider sharing with your own communities and in your region the children and families in detention and at the border letter that you can find on the disciples.org website. It's important too to follow the maps. The map that you see on the right is the one that Tana also had referred to earlier. It's so important to know how many detention centers are existing in our areas, and in particular the growth of them. I can say, just as a resident in Washington, D.C. and in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, that in the last 2 weeks, we have received breaking news reports about detention center expansions that are anticipated in Baltimore, expansions that are anticipated in Fairfax and elsewhere in Virginia, and detention center that for children that is anticipated to be expanding in Washington, D.C. This is not unique only to our area. And I cannot undergird enough how much there are efforts right now to be expanding the number of centers. So I really want to refer you to the map that you see at the left, which you can find on the Freedom for Immigrants website. It is a brand new map that they have put up. They had a previous map before that sort of showed all of the centers. It also showed where there were visitation programs that existed, but there's much more information that you are able to access about detention centers that are in the area of your own home and region. And so I strongly encourage you to go there for research. Let's go ahead.
A question. How many of these detention centers, immigration detention centers, are both in existence and the ones that are going to be expanded are for profit?
I'm really glad you asked, and we're exactly moving into that in the webinar right now. Because as you are pointing us to, Dean, it's also important that we follow the contracts, exactly as you were saying. So what we know is that about 70% of the current immigration detention contracts are held by private corporations. I want to lift up, it is amazing, and it is due to the tenacity and persistence of many faith partners as well as other human rights and immigrant rights partners that there have been 6 different banks who just over the last several weeks have agreed that they are going to phase out their contracts with immigrant detention centers. This is a huge movement, and you see, I mean, we're talking about the big players, Bank of America, SunTrust, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, NMP Paribas, which is in London, I believe, and Fifth Third Bank. So all of them have agreed that they will not any longer fund the 2 primary private corporations that hold the immigration contracts, which are for detention, which are GEO and CoreCivic. That represents close to $2 billion of funding that goes only to GEO and to CoreCivic. And it may be difficult for you to see, but even with 6 who have come forward and said they will turn away, we need to keep in check that many of their contracts, they're not pulling out of existing contracts. Many of those existing contracts go for as long as to 2023. And there are other banks still yet to come. So it's very important to follow the contracts. We'll go to the next slide and also lift up, for those that are not the privately held prison companies, there are contracts that are held with county, states, and local governments. And as detention has just ballooned almost unimaginably in the last 25 years, you can see these figures from 6,700 to 53,000 now. We continue to see not just those private contracts, but more and more efforts for detentions to centers to be built in partnership with our own local, county, and state governments. I really refer you to this American Progress article that, again, I can't say enough how recently this is happening. This also, this article came out since the time even that we were together at General Assembly, and it's an excellent kind of summary of some of the different locations around the country that are experiencing county and state and local contracts. We'll continue forward. So instead of those kind of contracts where what we know, for example, with GEO and with CoreCivic is that you get what you pay for, and you get from whom you pay what they are good at providing. So GEO and CoreCivic are prison companies. Therefore, the conditions of detention that they produce are the ones that they know how to produce, which means prison type conditions, even though as Tana so beautifully laid out, these are not individuals who are coming with criminal backgrounds. They most often are very young, or young adults, or children, or families, and we would hope for a very different style of how persons are able to wait until the outcome of their immigration cases have been finalized. So during, in this time, our faith communities are asking that government spending would promote family unity, that it would end unjust immigration and border policies, that we would have growing oversight of existing enforcement instead of growing funding for detentions, deportation, and militarization as options, and that we would continue to encourage our government to invest, instead of investing in prison type detention centers, that we would invest in non-restrictive community-based alternatives, many of them that often are faith community led and that operate on case management programs that are far more supportive and far less traumatizing of families. The Women's Refugee Commission is a great place to go to look for immigration solutions that really do, we believe, help get at the kind of root causes that are at play in the crisis of refugees that we're seeing, and that are far better solutions. We'll go ahead. We ask that you would also follow and keep learning about ways that all of us as faith communities really can make a difference in standing together with our neighbors, with helping to ensure that rights are understood, the rights that immigrants should be having. We can consider, for example, getting trained in how to, in the case of raids, how to film raids as they may be taking place and to respond rapidly, how we can accompany families that are able to get into our communities. It is often, as Tana said, a long process, so be prepared for a long-term relationship. Again, this is another reason why we hope you'll become an immigrant welcoming congregation, so that we can walk along with you, so that we can continue to assist you as you're doing this research to understand who you can partner with locally and what policies are at play in your community. There's a wonderful deportation defense guide specifically oriented towards faith partners that Faith in Action has produced. And on the right side is a resource that we just sent out in our RIMRAP that went out late yesterday, which is a follow-up from the raids in Mississippi. And it in particular has excellent resources about how faith partners can come together and be supportive when crises have been caused by ICE actions in their areas. We remind you that the committees that you see on the screen, Judiciary, Homeland Security, Appropriations, Department, again, Homeland Security as a unit. The first three are committees, and then the agencies of DHS, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the administration itself are the primary point persons who make, and the entities that make the decisions related to refugees and immigrants. So they are the ones who need to be hearing from us consistently. Don't forget that August recess is happening right now, and it's happening still for several more weeks. So we invite you to check in about who your leaders are legislatively, and please make sure that they are hearing from you. This is the time of the longest recess. We are in it, so we hope to be making really good use of it as faith partners. And I think the next slide just invites you to follow us if you are not already. I hope that you might be signed up for our electronic communications, which are called RIMRAPs. If you're not, go to our website and you can do it on the front page of that web page. And it is a primary way that we can ensure that we're providing ongoing education. We'll stop for there. We have not talked about all the solutions, but we are very excited about being able to collectively be God's body in partnership in such a very challenging time for immigrant neighbors.
Well, thank you so much, Dean, Tana, and Sharon. There were some questions. A few people did mention that they needed to drop off to get to another meeting, but I do have their questions and I want to share those with you all and get your responses. We have about 10 or so minutes to respond to some of these. So the first goes back to Tana when you were talking about the immigration judges and how they have their seats. So the question was, are immigration judges appointed by the president?
Yeah, so immigration judges are part of the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is actually part of the Department of Justice, the executive branch. So it's the Attorney General who appoints immigration judges.
Thank you. And then what consistent criteria, if any, is being used currently on expedited removal? So we had that whole conversation about how we get to the process of expedited removal, but what consistent criteria is being used during that? If any.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it consistent criteria. I mean, the threshold question is if someone can prove that they have been here for 2 years already, then they should not be subject to expedited removal. And then they should actually get a chance to go before a judge. I think one thing I guess I'll back up a little bit and explain about deportation is that once the government shows that someone is from another country, it's on the immigrant to show that they have a right to stay. And the arguments that you can use are just very specific paths to staying, very specific defenses, and they're not things like, I'm a good person, or I have no criminal record, or I have been here a really long time and have a family. Those things don't count. So no, I wouldn't say that there's a very consistent criteria. There are rules about who can be subject to expedited removal and not. But I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Sharon, I'm going to direct this question to you specifically, but anyone else that might have answers. The question is, do you have any advice about how to prevent new detention centers from being built in our region? So you were talking about that. This participant, Alexis, who you know lives in Northern Virginia and has been working to identify a place of interest for a new high-density child detention center. Organizers there are concerned that although our local officials, elected officials, mayors, county supervisors, et cetera, have voiced opposition, companies will find loopholes to go around local jurisdictions to build these centers or lease spaces to hold these children. So what can be done?
Yeah, I appreciate her both offering that question, and I'm glad Alexis is in the area. The most important thing to do first is to research in every way you can. You know, I gotta say, I feel like around the issues of immigration detention now, I hearken back to being in high school and how we were all taught to write research papers. And I think all of us need to use our very best research skills. You can go to that map. You can go to the link that Tana sent you to be sure you're finding out about the where the centers are coming. Keep an eye. Identify some folks in your congregation who might have particular interest in really watching the media, because often the stories come out quickly. No one story is likely to have all of the information that you need, but they help to point you to the next questions that you will want to be looking at. Look at who is it that's asking for the contract. Is it a contract that is going to be with your local entity, your state or your county commission? Or is it a contract that is one that's going to be run by one of the centers, such as Core Civic or GEO that we talked about on the private side? So identify who the targets are, and then learn what you can about their business. Find out what advocates are already doing, and a really excellent partnership that has been developing over the last year and a half or so is through momsrising.org, momsrising.org. And if there are individuals who are interested to become a part, and frankly, I really hope we can get more disciples who will consistently track what's happening there. That's a wonderful channel to follow the money for immigration detention contracts, because they're working on that constantly. And then the other piece is we have to be visible and consistently visible. When there is information in the newspaper, we know as faith partners how to use the newspaper, and a faith leader writing an op-ed has a really significant voice to be used in this time to express what are much more humane alternatives to immigration detention, the kind of case management that's needed, the faith-related partners who often run those programs instead of the prison-like conditions.
Thank you. One last question. I'm mindful of the time, but I think this one is an important one and a great way to wrap up. It's directed to both Tana and Sharon, but Dean, I would also welcome any comments from you if you have them. What is one hope you have for regional ministers, and I'll add for also the Disciples activists that will be taking part in this immersion trip? So what is one hope you have for this group, MBA staff, the general staff that are all going to be on this journey together in November?
I can go first. My hope would be that you're able to listen really well to particularly the people who are there long-term on the ground, and maybe even support and encourage them, because it is hard, long work. The people who are there long-term, and they feel, a lot of the people I met feel very alone in the work, feel forgotten. So I think that you all going down there can to provide that kind of support and real listening will be really valuable.
And I can say actually a couple of things. One thing I hope for is to know before we go who is going, so that we can go also aware of what is happening in our own regions and areas, and perhaps aware of what immigration detention and immigrant partners and groups exist for us, because I think that helps us to listen differently when we are there. Would love to partner with folks ahead of the time in going. And then when we're there, I in particular hope that we can listen for and celebrate what our faith partners are doing, what some of our global ministry partners are doing, and what they're asking for from us, so that we can come back and be more faithful interpreters to our regions and in our areas.
My hope is that this experience and the experience going down to the border will encourage us to continue to ask questions of those in authority, to ask questions of those who are policymakers, to continue to keep the questions coming, so that we have explanations as to why these policies are even in existence and how they're affecting people and why we should tolerate that. So I'm hopeful that more information that's shared, that more information that's understood will lead to more questions and will hold those who are accountable for these policies accountable. so that we can continue to be vigilant, and that we can continue to work for the least of these who oftentimes have no voice. And even in our places of ministry that may be remote, these issues are still there, and they will continue to be there until we make changes and have people who are in places of authority listen and change these laws so that there is a more humanitarian treatment of the folks who want just a simple life that is rewarding, healthy, and safe.
Thank you all. I think one final comment regarding our hopes for this trip is that that participants would see, experience, listen, as Tana and Sharon all said, to the stories there and be able to connect those stories back to your local community. This is not just a border issue, but as you saw in many of the maps, many of the figures that have been shown during this webinar, these are affecting our sisters and brothers in our own communities, and how then can we mobilize together? How can we commit to mobilize together to respond to the needs of all God's children? So, and we'll be working with this group. That this trip together is not the singular thing, but that we want to be together ongoing and have check-in points with one another about what we've committed to do, and how we can support one another and connect one another to other folks across the life of the church, folks like Tana and Sharon, folks like Matthew 25, who will be helping to guide us along the way, and all of those places across the life of the church that are doing this work. And if they just had a few more voices or a few more bodies, how much more impactful their work might be. So, so be encouraged. We want you to leave this webinar encouraged. There's a lot of information, but we can do it, I believe. I want to give thanks to Sharon and Tana for saying yes to leading us and to helping to orient our perspective as we take this journey in the next couple of months. And to Dean and Hector always, and other staff for being on the team of leading this work. This ends our webinar. We want to thank everyone for your time. The recording, again, will be shared with you. So we'll send that link out. I will also share that with you, Sharon and Tana, in case you want to use that as a resource in some ways. We look to have that out in the next couple of days, or at most the next week. Also, we want the group to save some dates on your calendar. Remember that October 10th, we'll have another webinar at 12 p.m. Central that will be focused from our mental health initiative on children and trauma. So we want to look at the mental health and wellness perspective around this crisis. And so we'll have that time together. And then we will have a trip orientation and overview hosted by Global Ministries and partners, either on October 24th or 25th. We're working with our partners to confirm which of those dates works best for them, for the folks that they're inviting to be on that call. So we will have a trip orientation hosted by Global Ministries and partners on October 24th or 25th, and then another webinar on October 10th around children and trauma. So thank you again for being with us. Please stay in contact, be in contact with us. Sharon and Tana are open also for questions or ways in which you can support their work. And so we encourage you to do that as well. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.